Hello everybody, my name is Squaggy, and let's talk about Magnolia Fantôme. Recently, Singapore just had its Lyrical Cup, and in it, I made top 32 with Magnolia Fantôme. Now, it's not a particularly impressive score. Out of 253 players, top 32 is pretty good, but nothing, crazy or earth-shattering. Even still, I wanted to talk about the deck because I know it's quite new, and a lot of you are either newer players or maybe EN players who are not going to have the deck for a while, so I thought I'd talk through my process, why I thought it was really good for the Lyrical metagame, and how I think you could play it kind of in a more open environment, like not Lyrical Cup, maybe for like a locals or something, because I think the deck is quite good. I don't think it's amazing or anything. I don't think you're going to win every game with it, obviously, and I don't even think it's like necessarily high-tiered, but I do think it is pretty good. So this is the deck that I brought. This is the deck list as a whole. Feel free to copy it. You can see the code beforehand. And this list is focused really heavily on kind of the shield value of the deck, right? So we have, this Blitz order gives a ton of shield. I'm focused a lot on using the grade 3 dragon here, the dragon for the strike deck that doesn't exist. You can get a ton of extra shield. I very rarely, if not never, use the first skill ever. I just find it kind of hard to weave in, especially because the LETTIAMATES are pretty good on board. And we are mainly going to be focusing on kind of being able to flood the board with this card, which is Energy Blast 2 to call her back to the rearguard circle. And this is not once per turn, this is not on place, this is as long as it's the main phase, you EV2 and it comes back. And when she swings, you can give her 5,000 power, and if you do at the end of the turn, you retire her, so you can actually bounce her back to save her and get more shield value without having to lose the unit on board. We can also see I'm on stuff like Twin Cast, because it works with the milling, and a high quantity of Tanu. I know a lot of people don't really like this card, like at high quantities, because it's a card that relies on you persona riding, but you persona ride very often, and there is always one column that is going to be boosted, so you do want to have booster always, and this is one of the best ones. I guess I can also go ahead and explain some of the omissions I have for this list. I know a lot of people really like Streja, and they really like the Shenri clone, I don't know her name. And those are fine cards, they synergize very well with the orders here. But for the Lyrical Cup, where I think the best decks in the room are definitely Krysrain, they are very aggressive strategies. And in these kind of strategies, I thought it was better to play more towards the grind aspect of Magnolia rather than trying to find a weird in-between slot. And in doing so, you can hit a really strong grind game. You can grind out their Divine Skill, which they're going to try and rip as fast as possible. You're going to be able to survive a ton of turns with high guard value. Cards like the Grade 3 Strike Dragon here, this to bounce back a ton of shield. You're always going to have enough shield in your hand to survive with this build. And then you're going to be able to grind out a game using a Crimson Moon and the Mates with You order. You're just going to filter the deck till you have a ton of triggers relative to the normal units in your deck, and you're just going to check a ton. For my games, basically, as long as I was swinging center, I was just declaring every trigger on the center, and I was breaking 2 to passes, 3 to passes, and there was very little my opponent could do because the deck was really filtered already, and I did expect to hit some of these. That's not to say it's a super skill-intensive kind of playstyle, it's kind of like Heart Luru, where you do have a lot of filter, you do check a ton of triggers, and that is your win con, and if you don't hit them, hey, what do? Not super skill expressive, but you can express yourself a little bit in terms of sequencing you do. You can do it in the way that you choose how to bounce or whether to use skills like Alpin, which for me personally, I think over the course of 7 games I played, I activated Alpin 0 times, and I think all those times I was right to not do it. I think energy is best used on your combined rusher kind of card, rather than getting the counter charge and soul charge, which you will rarely kind of need. Another reason for the omission of the aggressive cards, other than to preserve the defensive integrity of the deck, is that I think it contributes really hard to a deck out. With the way Streja works and the draw card works, you don't really need to hard draw cards. You usually have access to all your pieces just with the way the Crimson Moon and Mates with You works. And in doing so, cards like Shenri and Streja are going to find you cards that, adding more cards to your pool is good, but you're also using the resource, which is your deck. And in the Lyrical Cup environment, I was pretty worried about a lot of other grindy decks. Some people were playing Artisaria, the deck that won the whole event was Siana, and of course you're going to play the Mirror a lot because this is one of the newer decks. So I thought that it would be best if I didn't play towards a deck out because, I want to have that as a win con all the time, and I didn't think I needed more aggression to keep up with Krysrain. And I think I was right for most of it. Maybe the one game I lost in Swiss I would attribute to not having that kind of aggressive package, but for the most part, I think this call is good. I think you don't have to make this deck something it is not. I think the deck is good at grinding out, filtering a ton, and then hitting face, and just checking a lot of triggers. And I don't think it needs those really aggressive packages in order to see success. Speaking of things you don't need, I think I drew a card once of this in my 7 rounds of playing it. And for what it's worth, in the mirror match, the Magnolia Fantôme I was up against, they checked the overtrigger on turn 1, they checked their lyrical overtrigger on turn 1, so it was really good for them. But in general, they were also on the rare moon. They didn't have the double rare moon. And so if you wanted to pick up a deck that, I'm not going to say is cheap, but if you want to save a lot more money on these moons, I think the rare moon is fine. Another thing I guess we'll talk about omissions is that only on 2 Alpin. Alpin doesn't have an easy way to come back, and she struggles a lot in that Energy Blast 3 is expensive because, again, you want to pay the cost for her. And you're going to frequently pay the cost for her early on in the turn so that you have 4 units on board so that Mates with You gets all the effects off. You'll get 5k to 4 units if you just keep using her and Tanu to build your boards. As such, what I've often done is I've left Alpin on the board so that she can always hit 35k. She's a 10k intercept if you put her in the front row, but not much else. I think it's really difficult to find the time to use her skill. Especially again because deck out is a real win condition in a Lyrical Cup, for example, where a lot of the decks your opponent has doesn't have a lot of oomph, and you play against a ton of grindier Lyrical decks as well. You start to see your deck less of like a resource pool and more of like your HP bar. It becomes almost more important than damage in some matchups. So I thought it was important to preserve your deck size. And finally, for Lyrical Cup in particular, we were not on Elementaria. The Elementaria you're allowed to play in Lyrical's Magnolia is the Crest Elementaria. And obviously there are no crests in Lyrical Monasterio, so it's pretty useless to play that. And in general, I don't think you get a lot out of playing the other Elementaria either in any of your Lyrical decks, so I would just stick to 4 regular Perfect Guards. In addition, the only like kind of tech heal you would run is the critical heal, because Krysrain gets a lot of crit and Lyrical units barely bounce. They rarely restand, so the other one doesn't get a lot of value, except maybe against the Lutetia matchup. And as a result, I don't think you should be playing any effect heals, honestly, because it's just Krysrain and I think maybe Artisaria, which gain crit pretty regularly which are decks that you will see often. And I just don't think it is worth it just for that. I think it's more important you have an early guard for Krysrain anyways. So I'm going to show you guys some of the board plans that you would maybe want to set up in your games. The board plans are really simple, but just in case you haven't really tinkered with the deck yet, I just wanted to show you what I think is an optimal kind of offensive board this deck can produce. And this is going to be, without any of the generic pieces, none of the Shenris, none of the Streja. So if that's the ones holding you back, give this a shot, okay? Let's go over to Cardfight Connect, which is a simulator I use, and I'll show you what some of my boards were looking like that whole day. Before the video continues, I just want to advertise, I do have a Ko-Fi. I'm not going to paywall any content. Obviously, I don't really have a lot to paywall. But if you'd like to support the channel and what I do, and you want to see me, maybe try to upload a bit more regularly, maybe improve this microphone of mine, then any help would be appreciated. You don't have to donate. Just want to put it out there in case you do want to support the channel and what I do. Okay, back to the video. Okay. We're here at Cardfight Connect, so let me show you what I think an optimal attack pattern looks like. This is assuming my opponent is grade 2. I've just used Nehalem here as my proxy grade 2. And let's say using Mates with You, we can call back a unit. Let's say we use Delash, let's say we use Alpin, for example, and then we give these two 5k. This will also have 5k on the turn that you call it back, and let's say we're just going to give this 5k later. Into your opponent's 10k base, you want to try and make your magic number, so basically, any grade 2 will make a magic number. I like having a column be big, rather than having your booster be behind your Vanguard. The reason you do this is so that your opponent gets less value out of doing something like perfect guarding your center line, right? If you're on a 23k Persona right turn, and your opponent has to choose between hard guarding Magnolia and then perfect guarding the side, or if you put enough power towards the center, it's perfect guard the center, but then your sides are pretty easily hard guardable by like 15 and the defensive, for example. I think it's really easily beat if you do that, and I think the pressure is a lot lower. Like, for example, if my opponent hard guards the center line on Magnolia's triple drive after all the filter, you're going to check a ton of triggers. It's not very good for them to hard guard it. It is less optimal. They're always taking a risk that you could just randomly hit 3 triggers, and if you just put all center, you'll get fine value out of it. The threat is enough. I was basically not giving triggers to my side the whole day almost, unless it was a no pass or a perfect guard. And again, you're just gonna have to hope that you hit them. Your deck has very little pressure outside of that. I will kind of concede that point. You just have to hit those triggers. It's like Harluru. So in a board state like this, you're gonna want good attackers, and you're probably gonna want having Magnolia on your board. If you have Magnolia in your hand already, that's fine. Otherwise, you're gonna want to try and mill her off the top with all your mill cards like Lattice and the Soul. When you ride on to her, you want to use Mates of You to get a Magnolia back on the board. You can only use Mates of You to call back the grade 3 Magnolia. You can't use Lattice's skill, which is something I learned on the day itself, and it didn't affect too much. You just pivot your line so that Magnolia is the second thing you call back. And in doing this, you always kind of have Persona right for next turn. And because of this, the consistency of having Persona right, you're never going to whiff it, and you're always going to put on a ton of pressure onto your opponent. So this is how an attack pattern would look like, okay? So into 13 base, you don't want your cards to easily lose to a defensive. So going first, you can go these two first, right? You can go Magnolia here first, followed by Simius. And if they check a defensive, let's say, yeah, see? Okay, they check a defensive. At 10k, if you swung with these two first, then, you know, you don't have to swing a Simius anymore. Or, after swinging this, they check a defensive, then you swing Center. Then Center can check triggers and see if you can hit. Alpin will always hit 20, so she will always hit through a defensive as long as you use Mates with You on her. And I like making it so that Delage, or this column boosted, is the biggest. Because you're going to probably want to swing with Delage the last, because Delage is going to bounce a unit. For example, if Simius here had more power than Delage, it would make it kind of awkward because you would swing with Simius first, and then swing with Delage, for example. This isn't always the case, obviously, but sometimes those situations happen, and in that situation, you get to power climb a little more efficiently if this is your biggest column. So it would be like, this is 20, let's say, check 2 blanks, let's say that, let's say these are blanks. Yeah, and then you can do it like this, and then at the end of the battle, this goes to the soul, you bounce this back, and then you can use the Phantom skill, let's say in your drop zone, Phantom skill, and you put Magnolia back to your hand, and next turn, you just go again. And because you're the Simius, because you have a Tanu that's going to intercept as well, you have an extra like 30k shield off the Phantom skill, just like that, and you can Persona ride and easily rebuild your board. One of the things I like to bring up right now is that you should make sure your soul is strong. There is not, say, a soul issue, but you do use your soul a lot. When you use Mates with You, let me find it. Yeah, when you use Mates with You, you're going to soul last one. So that's one soul gone. To use Magnolia's skill, that's another soul gone. Or let's say Delage isn't in your soul. And if you want to use Valshablan, you should probably Energy Blast because otherwise you will have no soul. And with no soul, let's say going first, Alpin isn't going to be able to work. Delage going to soul will give you 1 soul for next turn. Persona right gives you 2. But from that position, it becomes really easy to whiff your soul. As the game progresses, if you do stuff like whiff a Delage, you may not have the resource to be able to soul charge onto your next main phase, and then you can't give your back row the attack. This happened a couple times in the mirror I played at Top Cut, so I think it is something that both players, we could have managed a little better. And for what it's worth, it's kind of rough to have Alpin soul charge because you might deck out a little faster if you soul charge 1. And obviously randomly soul charging after you filter your deck is not great because you're going to soul charge a ton of your useful triggers that you want in your hand when you drive check them. So I do recommend playing stuff like a Valshablan with energy so you can keep the soul resource a little tighter. Another thing to think about is when you use your Phantom skill and how many moons you want to bind. So for me personally, I basically only ever bound 1. Every turn I just bounded 1 so that I could always have a bounce for the next turn, so that I could always have, 5k shield extra is pretty good already. And with the amount of triggers you're going to be able to check, and the hard searching of stuff like PGs using Delage, who's in my soul, you are really going to have sufficient guard that you don't need to make everything in your hand a 15k. The only exception I had to this was going into something like the Krysrain Persona turn. That is where I thought the damage output might be a little too high, and I decided to pull back a bit and, lose out a turn later of bind because I didn't think I would have a later turn if I didn't use it now. But for the most part, against slightly slower decks, you don't have to use 2 moons on a turn. I think it's pretty detrimental to your overall game plan of grinding out a game if you use out your resource of the moons too fast. A lot of the deck is, when you boil down to it, it is a 5 attack deck with a ton of filter that checks a bunch of triggers, but at the same time, it's also a deck that does reward managing your resource well. It's just that some of those games, your resource management isn't going to matter as much as checking, the crit. But I think there are ways you can optimize it, there are ways where you can do it well, and you will be rewarded if you are able to sequence stuff well, manage your resources, so that you can get off to that turn where you just check 3 triggers and break a 3 to pass, which is what I was doing that whole day. In the grind game, for instance, this is where Simius comes really handy. You can EB like 2, EB2, 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 and call them all back. Then you use Mates with You, then you call back something, and then all of these units can get power, right? At least on a Persona turn. If it's not a Persona turn, then, just 2 units get power. But this at least gives you sufficient stuff on board to attack. A mistake that I was making kind of often was not counting my attacks before I used Simius, or just wasting energy to get stuff on board I didn't need. So I recommend not doing that. I'm not a perfect player, that's why I'm top 32 and not top 8. That's most of what I have to show you. I know it's not a lot, but I just wanted to show you a basic attack pattern and kind of explain the win condition of the deck, which is, check these 16 cards in your drive check. But I also want to talk about selecting a deck for an environment like this. So I did see a lot of players, some of my opponents who were stuff like Elementaria. They were on stuff like crit heals or restand heals, and I just found that very strange. Like, not that why would you run them, but more like I don't think they're as useful here as they are in the main game. In the main format, you're gonna run into stuff like Virgila, you're gonna run into stuff like, what's another popular restand deck? Heartluru. God, Heartluru. And in those scenarios, I do agree playing restand heals is good. If you're in the main format, restand heals all the way, 100%. But for my money, in a very more restricted environment like this, I think it is best to just play full vanilla heals and play 4 regular PGs, because Elementaria doesn't come up, because there are very rarely any guard restricts in Lyrical Monasterio that are relevant. When it comes to this deck in particular, I think you could build this kind of cheap. Not necessarily very, very cheap, like it will cost you $0, 0 cents. But I do think for what I consider a maybe low tier 3, maybe high tier 4 deck in the environment, I do think that this is good value for money in theory. Especially if you're like a lyrical player and you don't want to buy too many things, but you have a small lyrical collection built up maybe. Maybe you play a bit of Kyrie Grade 4 and you have these in your bulk. Maybe you just play some Sienna and you have like one of these lying around. If you don't want to buy the 4 RR Moons, again, I lost in top cut to an opponent who basically had my list but just was on the rare moons. That's fine. I think you are allowed to play this deck even if it's not quote-unquote optimal. And yeah, every once in a while you'll whiff the top 5 and you don't get compensation, but for the most part you will get something out of it. It's also not so bad because I'm pretty sure Delage can bounce anything. So Delage can just bounce back, let's say you call a trigger or something, that's good enough. I don't think she can bounce sentinels, but she can bounce triggers. So you can get some shield back to your hand anyways. Other things to note, just resource manage efficiently. The deck is really tight. You play on very tight margins because you're a hard guard deck that doesn't want to kind of get to too high of damage counts. CB will not always be readily available past the first couple turns because a lot of aggressive strategies will probably be able to rush you down and give you a lot of CB to work with. So early game you'll have a lot of Delage procs, you can have the Magnolia Counterblast proc, and in doing so, you will not have a lot of CB for the rest of the game if you're focused on guarding really hard. It can make it really easy to deny you, which is what my opponent did in Top Cut, and in those situations maybe you are tempted to use Alpin, but I imagine that if you are just a little better at managing your resource than I am, it won't be a problem. And I don't want to, say that I know better than anyone or anything, but I do think the Straight Job, Shenri package is a bit overrated. I think it's fine, but it also digs into your soul. It also kind of like adds a couple more bricks than you want to in the deck. There were a lot of top 7s I was doing on Karis' skill where I was finding like 1 LETTIAMATES and I was sweating. Like already having Valshablan and this guy in my deck. I feel like these girls are best played in Archetype for the most part, and you will benefit a lot if you just have the Archetype units. If you want a super budget build, take these 2 out, put in like a Lattice, put in maybe a Tanu if you want one. Like, that's fine. That's it. I don't think you can really avoid the 2 Valshablan. Maybe you can bump it up to 3 if it's cheaper than the Dragon. But I think the list here was fine. I think if I wanted to play a grindy deck like this, even in like a main tournament, maybe swap out the heals for some effect heals, and I would feel pretty comfortable bringing this out. I also think it's a lot easier than something like Krysrain. I think for Lyrical Cup, Krysrain is really appealing because its ceiling is really high, it's really fast. But I do think Krysrain rewards really precise ordering. I think it rewards very precise turn-to-turn play. For example, there are just a lot of little things in Krysrain that can add up if you are not playing it super optimally, if you're not getting the maximum value out of your units, especially for a deck that doesn't actually have a lot of high velocity. So you're going to so you can't rely on, not high velocity, but that doesn't have triple drive. So you can't sack your way out of games as easily as Magnolia can. So in a Lyrical Cup environment, I think this deck is better because it's easier and you can just sack your way out of games. I'm not exactly proud of winning games by sacking or whatnot, but that's what my deck is intended to do, and I am damn well gonna do it if I can. Still, deck is really fun. Think in a more limited environment like that, it was very good. I think it was probably the best thing you can bring, just because of ease of play, because the strategy was pretty simple, but also just takes a bit of getting used to the sequencing, and you'll be pretty good at it. And, take this from a player who, this is their first top. I also think that this deck could probably be fine in a real tournament, like a real event where you can play whatever you want. I think this will be fine. Not amazing. I think it has some iffy matchups into high, fast, aggressive decks, but it's fine. It really is okay. It really is okay after like a couple turns of filtering. By that point, you'll be fine. I think in like my game 5, my opponent 3'd past me and my deck had 2 non-triggers out of 12 cards, and I just checked crit like front, and that was it. So that's all I had to say. I just kind of wanted to talk about the deck because I'm pretty excited about having one of my first tops ever. You know, top 32 isn't, you know, something amazing, but it's pretty good for someone who is taking it more, who's taking the game a bit more seriously these days. You know, it's really cool that I finally got to set top tables with a lot of faces I do recognize as really good players, and you know, I felt quite good about that. And that's about it. I just want to share what I think this deck can do, why I think it's good in a limited environment, and just give you a bit of insight into like the game plan. I've realized this whole time that I've been kind of on the Cardfight Connect screen rather than the deck lock screen, which is this one. So I'll put this in the Cardfight Connect area where I was supposed to put it. But yeah, sorry, I just got really excited. Okay, that's it from me. Sorry this is a bit of a sloppier upload. I just wanted to talk about the list. I'm just very happy about it. Let me know if you want to pick this up. Let me know if this helped you kind of conceptualize the deck a little better. And yeah, I hope you're willing to try this out. And that's all from me. Bye-bye. Thank you to my supporters on Ko-Fi, Lang Long, and Big Ben. Thank you for helping the Swaggy conglomerate produce more great content.